Welcome back to Void of Fears, where the line between nightmares and reality blurs with every story. Our community grows stronger with each brave soul who joins us. We're 8,000 deep now, creeping toward our goal of 10,000 subscribers by year's end. If you dare to continue this journey with us, hit that subscribe button now. Leave your mark with a like. Share your own encounters in the comments below. Now, let's begin today's story. The wind howled across the Alaskan tundra, driving snow against the reinforced windows of the Quantum Research Facility. Located 200 miles from the nearest town, the facility's brutalist architecture stood in stark contrast to the pristine wilderness surrounding it. 6 massive concrete buildings connected by underground tunnels formed a compound designed to withstand both the harsh environment and unwanted attention. Captain Alexander Reynolds jolted awake as the emergency klaxons blared throughout his quarters. The digital clock on his nightstand read 3:17 a.m. His hand instinctively reached for the bottle of painkillers beside it, but he stopped himself. He needed clarity tonight. "Security breach in Sector 7, announced the automated system. "All personnel report to emergency stations." Reynolds grabbed his sidearm from the bedside drawer and pulled on his boots. 6 months at this isolated outpost had trained him to move with practiced efficiency during alerts, but something in the alarm's persistent wail felt different this time. The facility housed some of the government's most sensitive research, which is why they'd recruited him after his Special Forces career. After 15 years of military service across 3 continents, he thought he'd seen everything. Afghanistan, Yemen, operations that never made the official records. None of it had prepared him for what awaited below. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror as he pulled on his tactical vest. At 42, his face showed the weathering of too many deployments and too little peace. The recent weight loss had hollowed his cheeks, but he'd attributed it to the stress of the new position when speaking with others. The truth, which he kept locked away, was far more terminal. In the corridor, researchers and security personnel rushed past. The overhead lights flickered, casting momentary shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. Reynolds caught Dr. Eleanor Wright by the arm as she hurried past, clipboard clutched to her chest, eyes wide with panic. At 53, Wright was the facility's senior researcher, brilliant and driven, with a reputation for pushing boundaries that had made Reynolds uneasy from his first day. "Doctor, what's happening?" he demanded. "The containment field collapsed," she said, her voice barely audible above the alarm. "The experiment, it worked too well. We need to get to the command center immediately." The command center buzzed with frantic activity. Located on the 2nd floor of the main building, its reinforced glass windows overlooked the central courtyard, now obscured by the blizzard. Technicians shouted status reports while security personnel established a perimeter. On the main screen, security footage from Sector 7 showed the cavernous laboratory where Wright's team conducted their experiments. A pulsating tear hovered in the center of the room, its edges rippling like disturbed water. The tear glowed with an unnatural light that seemed to absorb, rather than emit, illumination. 16 minutes ago, the dimensional barrier experiment exceeded all projected parameters, Dr. Wright explained, addressing the assembled emergency response team. Her British accent became more pronounced under stress, giving her words a clipped urgency. "The containment field failed, and we've lost contact with 5 researchers who were in the chamber at the time." The footage showed the researchers being pulled toward the rift, their bodies stretching unnaturally before disappearing into the void. Reynolds felt his stomach clench. He had authorized the personnel for that test, trusting Wright's assurances that it was routine. "What exactly were you people working on down there?" he asked, his voice hardening. Wright hesitated before answering, exchanging glances with her colleague, Dr. Alexis Morgan. Morgan gave an almost imperceptible nod. "A theoretical doorway between dimensions," Wright finally said. "The government wanted to explore potential applications for energy harvesting, and transportation, we've been detecting quantum resonance patterns between our reality and what we call a shadow dimension that exists alongside our own. A technician interrupted, his voice tight with fear. "Dr. Wright, we're detecting an unknown substance emerging from the ventilation system on level 5. On another monitor, security cameras captured a dark, viscous matter seeping through the vents. It moved against gravity, crawling up walls and across ceilings. Where it touched metal, the surfaces corrode instantly. A security guard attempted to collect a sample, but when his gloved hand contacted the substance, the material of his glove began to dissolve. He pulled back just in time, the glove's synthetic fibers unraveling into nothing. "It's coming from the other side," whispered Dr. Wright. "We need to evacuate the facility immediately." "Not possible," said Major James Cooper, the military liaison assigned to the facility. A career Army officer in his late 30s, Cooper had been stationed at the facility 3 months longer than Reynolds. His buzz cut and rigid posture marked him as military, even in civilian clothes. He gestured to the external cameras, which showed the blizzard raging outside. "The storm's too severe. Choppers can't fly in this, and the road is impassable. We're on our own for at least 36 hours. Reynolds watched as the black substance continued to spread throughout the lower levels. On the monitors, they could see it flowing down corridors, avoiding living tissue but consuming everything inorganic in its path. In one disturbing sequence, it flowed around a researcher, leaving him untouched, while dissolving his clipboard and the metal door behind him. "Then we need to contain this situation ourselves," Reynolds decided, taking command naturally. "What options do we have?" Dr. Alexis Morgan, Wright's deputy, spoke up from her station. 36 years old with auburn hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, Morgan had a reputation for brilliance, balanced by caution. A counterweight to Wright's ambition. She tapped on her tablet, bringing up a series of complex readings on the main screen. "The rift appears to be growing, but at a calculable rate. Based on our readings, we have approximately 6 hours before it stabilizes permanently." "And then what happens?" Reynolds asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Then, nothing stops it from expanding indefinitely," Morgan replied, her green eyes reflecting the glow of her tablet. "Theoretical models suggest it could eventually engulf the entire region, possibly more." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The facility employed over 100 people, with millions of dollars in equipment and research materials. "Can we close it from our side?" Cooper asked, breaking the silence. Dr. Wright shook her head, her silver-streaked hair coming loose from its clip. "The energies involved are too volatile. Any attempt to seal it from here would likely accelerate the expansion. We tried a localized EMP burst 10 minutes ago, and it only widened the tear." "So what are you saying?" Reynolds pressed, stepping closer to the display showing the pulsating rift. Morgan looked up from her tablet, exchanging another meaningful glance with Wright. "We need to close it from the other side. We've been developing a quantum resonance device that could theoretically collapse the rift, but it needs to be placed at the origin point, in the shadow dimension." Reynolds stared at the pulsating tear on the screen. Beyond it, he caught glimpses of a landscape that defied description, darkness that moved with purpose. "You're talking about sending people through that thing, into whatever hellscape lies on the other side?" "It's our only option," Wright confirmed, her voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of what she proposed. "We need volunteers who can deploy the device and activate it remotely." Reynolds rubbed his face, feeling the 3-day stubble scrape against his palm. He thought of the letter from his oncologist, tucked away in his quarters. 6 months at most, they'd said. Aggressive treatment might buy him time, but not a cure. He'd come to Alaska partly to escape the reality of his diagnosis. "I'll go," he said firmly. "This is technically a security situation, which makes it my responsibility." "You'll need a team," Cooper said, stepping forward. "I'm in." Dr. Morgan nodded, setting down her tablet with finality. "You'll need someone who understands the device. I helped design it. I should go too." Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, the facility's lead engineer, joined them. At 61, he was the oldest member of the senior staff, with deeply lined features that spoke of decades of intense concentration. "The containment device requires specific calibration. I will accompany you." Lieutenant Zoe Williams, Reynolds' second in command in security, checked her weapon. A former Marine with 11 years of service before joining the private sector, Williams had proven herself both capable and loyal during the months they'd worked together. "You'll need additional firepower, sir. I'm volunteering." Reynolds looked at the determined faces before him. None of them fully understood what they were volunteering for. How could they? But the alternative was to wait for the rift to consume them all. "We have less than 6 hours to prepare, deploy, and complete the mission," he said, checking his watch. "Let's move." In the equipment bay, the team prepared for their journey. The large room normally housed environmental suits for the facility's periodic external maintenance during the harsh Alaskan winters, but Dr. Tanaka had modified 5 suits for their specific mission. Each suit's normally bright orange exterior had been reinforced with a mesh of finely woven metal, giving them a muted silver appearance. The suits include oxygen recyclers and temperature regulation systems, Tanaka explained as they suited up, his Japanese accent becoming more pronounced as he detailed the technical aspects. "I've added protective layering that should resist corrosion from the black substance we observed. They should protect against most environmental hazards, but we're entering uncharted territory." Reynolds checked his suit's seals, noting the additional weight of the reinforcement. "Duration?" 8 hours of oxygen at normal consumption rates, Tanaka replied. "The power cells will last approximately 12 hours. Morgan demonstrated the tethering system, thin cables made of an experimental alloy that connected to harnesses on their suits. The cables shimmered with an unusual blue luminescence when flexed. "These will maintain a quantum link to our dimension," she said, securing her own tether to a central anchor point. "Theoretically, they should help us find our way back to the entry point even if visibility or navigation becomes compromised." Reynolds examined the communication devices. Each resembled a standard military-grade radio with additional components attached to the casing. "Will these work on the other side?" "They utilize quantum entanglement," Morgan explained, pointing to a small violet crystal embedded in each unit. "As long as the particles remain entangled, we should maintain communication regardless of dimensional barriers. We've tested them in Faraday cages and deep underground. The signal never degrades." The containment device sat on a reinforced cart, a metallic sphere approximately 3 feet in diameter, housing a glowing blue core, visible through small viewports in its casing. The sphere was surrounded by intricately designed machinery, featuring dozens of adjustable components. Tanaka patted it proudly. "My finest work," he said, eyes crinkling at the corners. "When activated, it will generate a resonance field that should collapse the rift permanently. The field propagates using the same energy signature as the rift itself, essentially turning its power back upon itself." As they made final preparations, checking weapons and equipment, Reynolds pulled Cooper aside into an adjacent storage room. "What aren't they telling us?" he asked quietly, watching through the doorway as the scientists made final adjustments to the device. Cooper glanced over his shoulder, then lowered his voice further. "The government was extremely interested in this project. More than makes sense for pure research. When I first arrived, before you took over security, there were weekly visits from Pentagon officials and some agencies that didn't identify themselves. What were they looking for?" "The shadow dimension apparently contains energy sources we can't even comprehend. Wright's early experiments suggested power generation potential that would make nuclear energy look like a campfire in comparison." "So this was never just about scientific discovery," Reynolds concluded, a familiar bitterness rising in his throat. How many times had he seen similar patterns in his military career? Scientific endeavours perverted by those seeking weapons or power. Is it ever? Cooper replied grimly. But right now, we've got a more immediate problem than government overreach. Reynolds nodded, watching as Williams helped Morgan adjust her environmental suit. Keep an eye on Wright while we're gone. She strikes me as the type who might have contingency plans we don't know about. Already on it, Cooper assured him. I've got people monitoring all outgoing communications. They descended through the facility using the central elevator shaft, bypassing the areas where the black substance had been detected. The elevator car moved smoothly at first, but as they passed level 4, it began to shudder. The lights flickered, and the digital floor indicator glitched, sometimes showing impossible numbers. The anomaly is affecting the electrical systems, Tanaka observed, steadying himself against the wall. The effect grows stronger as we approach the source. They disembarked at level 6 and continued on foot, passing emergency barriers and security checkpoints. Many of the checkpoints had been abandoned, their guards evacuated to upper levels. The lower they went, the more evidence they found of the rift's influence. Metal surfaces warped in impossible directions. Light bent around corners, creating shadows that pointed in contradictory directions. In some corridors, gravity seemed lighter. In others, each step required enormous effort. The barrier between dimensions is thinning throughout this level, Morgan explained, consulting a handheld device. Reality itself is becoming malleable. The air grew thicker as they approached Sector 7, carrying an electrical charge that made hair stand on end and caused the occasional spark to jump between metal objects. A distant rumbling, like thunder but somehow wrong, resonated through the structure. On level 6, they encountered their first casualty. The corridor leading to the main laboratory anteroom curved gently to the right, the walls lined with status monitors, now displaying only static. As they rounded the bend, a figure stumbled toward them from a darkened side passage. "Hello? Is someone there?" Williams called, raising her tactical light. Dr. Thomas Fletcher, one of the missing researchers, lurched into the beam of light, but something was horribly wrong. His lab coat hung in tatters from his frame, and his skin had become translucent, granting glimpses of his underlying musculature. Except it wasn't just muscle they saw beneath. His flesh crawled with darkness, veins pulsing with shadow rather than blood. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. His eyes, once brown according to his personnel file, now reflected depths that couldn't possibly exist within a human skull. "Help! Me!" he gasped, his voice echoing strangely as if coming from multiple throats. "It's aware, it knows, we're here." Fletcher lurched forward, extending a hand toward them. Where his fingers touched the wall, the metal surface rippled like water. "Dr. Fletcher, stay where you are," Reynolds commanded, raising his hand in a halting gesture. "We need to assess your condition." Fletcher's head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes focusing on Morgan. Recognition sparked in their impossible depths. "Alexis, the calculations were wrong. The symmetry isn't stable." He lunged suddenly at Morgan, moving with unexpected speed. Reynolds reacted instantly, tackling the transformed researcher to the ground. Up close he could see that Fletcher's flesh rippled with movement beneath the surface, as if something else now inhabited his body. The skin felt unnaturally cold, almost gelatinous, to the touch. "Thomas, it's us!" Morgan cried, recovering from her initial shock. "We can help you!" Fletcher convulsed violently under Reynolds' restraint, his strength far greater than his slender frame suggested. "Too late for me. It's, coming through, using us as conduits." His jaw distended, stretching wider than humanly possible, and a sound emerged that resembled no language they recognized. a series of clicks and subsonic vibrations that made their fillings ache. William stepped forward and administered a powerful sedative from the medical kit, plunging the injector into Fletcher's neck. His struggles weakened, then ceased altogether, though the darkness continued to pulse beneath his now still form. "We can't help him now," Cooper said quietly, pulling Reynolds away from the unconscious researcher, "but we can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Reynolds stared down at Fletcher's transformed body. "We should restrain him and alert the medical team to retrieve him once we've proceeded. They might learn something that could help us." They secured Fletcher with reinforced cable ties, the only restraints they had, and marked his position on the facility map. Morgan knelt beside him briefly, whispering an apology, before rejoining the group. They continued downward, each level showing greater signs of transformation. On level 7, the corridor architecture itself had begun to change. Doorways no longer aligned perfectly with their frames. Ceiling panels floated untethered, rotating slowly. The floor occasionally rippled like the surface of a pond. Reality itself seemed to thin as they approached Sector 7. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Sounds echoed before they were made. In one unsettling moment, they all heard Williams's voice ask a question about the tether system seconds before she actually spoke the words. "Time displacement," Morgan murmured, fascinated despite the danger. "Causality is becoming unstable near the breach." Finally, they reached the laboratory entrance. Through the reinforced glass, they could see the rift had grown considerably since the initial footage. Now a swirling vortex nearly 10 feet in diameter. Around it, reality warped and distorted like fabric under tension. Equipment had been tossed aside by unknown forces. Research materials floated in mid-air, caught in localized anti-gravity fields. Reynolds assembled the team for a final briefing, their environmental suits, external lights casting long shadows down the corridor. "Once we cross, stay together," he instructed, his voice steady despite the churning in his gut. "Our priority is placing the device at the origin point, activating it, and getting out before it detonates. If we get separated, follow your tethers back to the entry point." "Questions?" The team exchanged glances, the gravity of their mission evident in their expressions. No one spoke. "I want to say something," Cooper said after a moment. "I've been in combat situations where the odds look bad. This is different. We don't know what's waiting for us. But I do know this. Whatever happens on the other side, it's been an honor serving with each of you." Reynolds nodded in acknowledgement. In another time, he might have given a speech about duty and sacrifice. Now, with his own mortality already a certainty, such words seemed hollow. "Let's do this," William said, checking her weapon one final time. They entered the laboratory, cautiously. The air near the rift felt heavy, resistant to movement, as if they were walking through invisible molasses. Strange whispers emanated from the tear, just below the threshold of comprehension. Occasionally a word or phrase would become clear, boundary, flesh, becoming, before dissolving back into unintelligible sounds. Tanaka pushed the cart containing the device to within a few feet of the boundary. The closer it got to the rift, the more the blue core pulsed in rhythm with the swirling vortex, as if recognizing a counterpart. "Remember, we have 6 hours before the rift stabilizes," Morgan reminded them, checking the chronometer built into her suit. "The device needs 30 minutes to reach critical activation once deployed." Reynolds approached the edge of the rift. Up close he could see it wasn't simply a tear in space. It was a boundary between realities. Through it he glimpsed a distorted version of the laboratory, as if viewed through dark water. But beyond that first layer of familiarity lay a landscape that made no sense to human eyes. A terrain of flowing shapes and moving shadows, under a sky that seemed to both exist and not exist simultaneously. Tether's secure, Williams confirmed, checking each team member's connection to the central anchor. Communication check. Each team member verified their comms were functioning. The quantum entanglement devices emitted a soft violet glow, pulsing gently. "On my mark," Reynolds said, taking a deep breath and positioning himself at the edge of the rift. The air tingled against his exposed face, the last part of him not covered by the environmental suit. 3, 2, 1, mark. Together they stepped through the rift. The transition felt like being pulled through ice-cold syrup. For a heartbeat, Reynolds experienced the sensation of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. His consciousness stretched across multiple planes of existence. He perceived realities layered upon realities, each slightly different from the last. Versions of the facility where the experiment had never happened, where different people stood in their places, where the building had never been constructed at all. Then, with a feeling of displacement that left him momentarily disoriented, they emerged onto the other side. The shadow dimension unfolded around them in terrible majesty. They stood in a twisted version of their laboratory, but the similarities ended at the basic structure. The walls pulsed with dark energies that flowed like blood through veins. The ceiling arched impossibly high, despite the facility having multiple levels above. Equipment from their lab existed here too, but transformed. Computers had merged with the walls. Monitors displayed impossible geometries, and metal shelving had been reshaped into twisted sculptures. Outside the room's boundaries, visible through walls that were sometimes solid and sometimes transparent, a landscape of nightmarish terrain stretched toward a horizon that seemed both infinitely distant and oppressively close. Mountains rose and fell like breathing lungs. Valleys filled with swirling mist that occasionally coalesced into shapes suggesting awareness. The sky, if it could be called that, churned like a sea of living darkness, occasionally flashing with energy discharges that illuminated the scene in stark relief. During these flashes, structures from their world appeared as ghostly outlines superimposed over alien geometries that hurt the eyes to follow. "Atmosphere reading," Reynolds demanded, struggling to adjust to the heavy air that seemed to resist their movements like thick gel. "Breathable, barely," Morgan confirmed, checking her instruments. "High nitrogen content, trace elements unknown to our periodic table. Oxygen levels sufficient, but with unusual isotopic composition." She paused, making adjustments to her scanner. "There's also something else present, a field of energy, with properties similar to electric and magnetic fields, but different somehow. It seems to permeate everything." The sounds of their voices behaved strangely, sometimes seeming to travel far beyond their intended range, other times becoming so muffled they could barely hear each other standing side by side. When Cooper spoke, his words briefly became visible, as glowing symbols that faded after a few seconds. "Movement, 10 o'clock, he pointed, raising his weapon instinctively. In the distance, beyond what appeared to be the ruined wall of their laboratory, humanoid forms composed of shifting darkness observed them. The entities had no discernible features except for occasional suggestions of eyes or limbs that formed and dissipated within their fluid bodies. They made no sound and presented no obvious threat, but conveyed a sense of intense curiosity. As the team watched, the beings mimicked their postures perfectly, like shadowy reflections. "They're studying us," Morgan whispered, fascinated. "Are they hostile?" Williams asked, raising her weapon slightly. "Don't provoke them," Reynolds ordered. "We stick to the mission. If they wanted to attack, they would have done it while we were disoriented from the crossing." Tanaka consulted a handheld device, its screen flickering with interference. "I'm detecting energy signatures similar to those from our missing personnel, approximately half a kilometer in that direction." He pointed towards what appeared to be a valley between two ridges of undulating terrain. "That matches the general direction of our facility's west wing," Morgan noted. The topography here seems to mirror our world, but twisted. They moved cautiously through the alien landscape, pushing the cart with the containment device. The ground beneath their feet sometimes felt solid, sometimes yielded like flesh. Buildings and structures from their world appeared intermittently, ghostly and distorted, as if this dimension shared occasional points of contact with their own. The shadow entities followed at a distance, never approaching, but never fully retreating. Occasionally their numbers would increase as more joined the observation, then decrease as some departed on unknowable errands. Their movement left faint trails in the air, like ink dispersing in water. "Do you think they're indigenous to this dimension?" Morgan asked quietly as they navigated around a formation that resembled a melted version of the facility's water tower. "They seem adapted to it," Reynolds replied, noting how the entities flowed through spaces that would have impeded solid beings. "But that doesn't necessarily mean they evolved here. They could be transformed, like Fletcher." The landscape shifted subtly as they walked, adjusting to their presence. Paths formed before them, then dissolved behind them. Structures rose to block routes that might have led them astray from their destination. In one remarkable instance, a chasm that had opened in their path sealed itself when they approached, the edges flowing together like liquid. "It's like the whole dimension is alive," Morgan observed, recording readings on her device, responding to our presence, possibly even our intentions. After what felt like hours but registered as merely 40 minutes on their chronometers, another sign of temporal distortion, they reached a depression in the landscape. The valley Tanaka had detected on his instruments had deepened into a basin surrounded by writhing tendrils that resembled tree trunks made of shadow. In the center of this basin, half embedded in the malleable ground, they found 3 of the missing researchers. Dr. Abigail Patel raised a hand weakly as they approached. Her environmental suit had been partially absorbed into her body, dark tendrils extending from the ground and connecting to her flesh. Beside her, Dr. Robert Chen and Dr. Jason Diaz were in similar states of transformation, their bodies merging with the environment in a process that appeared both horrifying and strangely beautiful. "You shouldn't be here," Patel managed, her voice resonating oddly through their communication devices. "It knows you've come to harm it." Reynolds knelt beside her, noting that despite her transformation, her eyes remained human, frightened but aware. "We're here to rescue you, to close the rift." Patel shook her head, an action that sent ripples through the connected tendrils. "You don't understand. This place, it's not just a dimension, it's a living ecosystem, perhaps even a single organism on some level. The rift is like a wound, and it's trying to heal itself." "A wound we caused," Morgan said, her voice tight with guilt. "No," Patel corrected. "The connection was always there, dormant. Our experiment just awakened it. Now it's defending itself against what it sees as an invasion. The black substance in our facility, it's like antibodies trying to neutralize a pathogen." Cooper scanned the horizon. The shadow entities are gathering. Indeed, dozens of the dark figures now surrounded them at a distance, their forms shifting constantly. Some had grown larger, towering over their companions. Others had developed more defined features, suggestions of faces, of multiple limbs, of wings or tentacles. "Can we move you?" Reynolds asked Patel, assessing the extent of her connection to the ground. She laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "I'm part of it now. We all are. It's not unpleasant once you accept it. The knowledge here, the perspective. I've learned more about the fundamental nature of reality in these hours than in my entire scientific career." "Dr. Patel, we need to find the origin point of the rift," Tanaka interjected. "Our dimension is in danger. The incursion is spreading." "Both dimensions are in danger," Patel countered. "The boundary was never meant to be crossed this way." She pointed toward a distant structure that resembled a tower of flowing darkness that occasionally solidified into crystalline formations before dissolving again. There. That's where the worlds are thinnest. Your device might work there. Reynolds checked their tether lines and communications. We need to move. Dr. Patel, can you tell us anything else that might help? It responds to intention, she said, her eyes reflecting the swirling sky above. Your emotions, your thoughts, they shape how it reacts to you. Fear breeds hostility. Curiosity elicits response. The entities, we call them shades, they communicate through shared perception rather than language. She grasped Reynolds' wrist suddenly, her partially transformed hand feeling both solid and fluid simultaneously. Be careful at the tower. It's guarded by something different, more aware, more powerful. It recognized me as a scientist, knew I could be useful as a conduit for understanding. But you, she looked at their weapons, it will perceive as threats. Williams helped Reynolds to his feet. Sir, we're down to 4 hours and 17 minutes. With a final glance at the partially transformed researchers, they continued toward the tower. The journey grew increasingly challenging. Gravity shifted unpredictably. At times they found themselves nearly floating, at others barely able to move under their own weight. Time seemed to flow irregularly, with moments stretching into eternities and hours passing in heartbeats. The landscape became more alien the closer they got to the tower. Structures rose and fell like waves in an ocean. The ground developed patterns that rearranged themselves continuously, sometimes forming recognizable symbols from human mathematics and language, before dissolving back into chaos. In some areas, their equipment aged rapidly, metal components developing decades of corrosion in seconds. In others, wounds on their hands from minor injuries healed instantly. The laws of physics are suggestions here at best, Morgan commented as they passed through a zone where light bent around their bodies, casting multiple shadows in impossible directions. It's as if reality itself is more fluid, more malleable. The shadow entities, the shades, as Patel had called them, kept pace with them, growing more numerous. Their behavior had changed, less observational, more purposeful. They began to arrange themselves in formations that herded the team towards specific paths. I think they're guiding us, Tanaka suggested as they followed a route between two rows of the entities. Or corralling us, Cooper countered grimly, keeping his weapon ready despite Reynolds' earlier instructions. As they approached the base of the tower, the environment changed dramatically. The chaotic fluidity of the landscape gave way to a more structured arrangement. The ground solidified into a smooth, glassy surface that reflected not their physical forms, but something else, shadowy approximations of their inner selves. In Morgan's reflection, equations and formulas swirled. Cooper's showed battlefields from his past. Tanaka's displayed intricate machinery in perpetual motion. Reynolds avoided looking at his own reflection but couldn't help catching glimpses: a hospital room, a doctor's grave expression, a clock with hands that moved too quickly. The air grew thick with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. Each breath felt charged, as if they were inhaling pure energy rather than air. The tower itself defied comprehension, a structure composed of what appeared to be flowing darkness given solid form. It stretched upward until it merged with the churning sky, its surface constantly shifting and reforming. Occasionally patterns would emerge, faces, landscapes, complex mechanisms, before being absorbed back into the whole. The origin point should be inside, Morgan said, consulting her instruments, though they now sparked and glitched unpredictably. The energy readings are off the charts. Before they could proceed, the ground before them erupted. The glassy surface shattered as something massive pushed through from beneath. The team stumbled backward as a colossal entity assembled itself before them. Unlike the smaller shades, this being incorporated elements that seemed harvested from both dimensions. Parts of it resembled technological components from their world. Fragments of machinery, sections of computer systems, scientific instruments, fused with the flowing darkness of this realm. It towered over them, easily 20 feet tall, a guardian constructed from the very fabric of interdimensional space. "Hold your fire," Reynolds commanded, as Williams raised her weapon instinctively. "Remember what Patel said, it responds to intention." The guardian extended appendages that weren't quite arms, reaching toward them with deliberate slowness. Where it touched the air, reality rippled, creating concentric circles like stones dropped in water. "What do we do?" Cooper asked, his voice tight with tension. Morgan stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We need to show it we're not a threat." "We are a threat," Tanaka whispered. "The device will collapse part of this dimension." The Guardian paused, as if hearing Tanaka's words. Its form shuddered and grew more solid, more threatening. The machinery components within its body began to glow with increasing intensity. "It's reading our thoughts," Reynolds realized. "Everyone. Focus. Project Calm. We're here to heal the rift, not destroy this world." "How exactly do we project calm when facing that?" Cooper muttered. But he lowered his weapon and took a deep breath. The team stood their ground, concentrating on thoughts of repair, of sealing the wound between worlds. Morgan went further, visualizing the mathematics of dimensional stability, of balanced energy states between realities. Tanaka focused on the containment device's function as a healing mechanism, rather than a weapon. Slowly, the Guardian's posture changed. Its towering form became less aggressive, more inquisitive. It reached out again, this time touching the containment device. A pulse of energy passed between them. The blue core of the device glowed brighter in response. The Guardian's form rippled from the point of contact, waves of change propagating throughout its massive body. "It's communicating with the quantum matrix," Morgan said in wonder. "The resonance frequencies are aligning." After what seemed like an eternity, the Guardian withdrew, then parted like a curtain, revealing an entrance to the tower. The opening pulsed gently, an invitation. "I think we just got permission," Williams said, her voice reflecting a mixture of relief and disbelief. They entered cautiously, pulling the cart with the containment device. Inside, the tower opened into a vast chamber that seemed larger than the exterior could possibly contain. The walls flowed with currents of darkness, occasionally forming into recognizable shapes. Laboratory equipment, computer terminals, fragments of their world integrated into this one. At the chamber's center floated a pulsating vortex of energy, the other side of the rift. Through it, they could see distorted images of their facility. The vortex rotated slowly, its edges occasionally extending tendrils that reached into the chamber before being drawn back. Surrounding the rift was a chamber composed of structures that appeared both organic and mechanical, a hybrid of technologies and living tissue. Columns resembling both tree trunks and supercomputers supported a dome that mirrored the churning sky outside. The entire room pulsed with energy, flowing toward the rift as if trying to repair it. "This is it," Morgan confirmed. "The origin point." Tanaka began setting up the containment device, carefully positioning it near the rift. "I need about 10 minutes to calibrate it properly. The resonance frequencies are more complex than we anticipated." As he worked, Reynolds noticed Cooper staring at his own hand. The Major had removed his glove, revealing skin marbled with dark veins. The Major had removed his glove, revealing skin marbled with dark veins that spread beneath the surface like a web. The darkness pulsed in rhythm with the chamber around them. "Cooper," Reynolds said quietly, moving closer to inspect the transformation. "How long?" The Major flexed his fingers, watching the darkness spread incrementally. "Started about 20 minutes ago. Doesn't hurt yet. I can finish the mission." He pulled the glove back on with a grimace. "Just keep an eye on me. if I start acting like Fletcher?" Reynolds nodded, understanding the unspoken request. "We'll cross that bridge if we come to it." While Tanaka worked on the device, Morgan circled the chamber, taking readings and examining the structures. Her face grew increasingly troubled as she studied the formations around the rift. "These formations? They're trying to heal the rift naturally," she observed, pointing to tendrils of energy that reached from the chamber walls towards the pulsating vortex. "Given enough time, they might succeed without our intervention." "We don't have time," Williams reminded her, checking the chronometer on her wrist. "Our world is being affected now. The black substance has probably reached the upper levels already." Tanaka suddenly stopped working, his expression grave as he examined readings from the device. His hands, normally steady even in crisis, trembled slightly. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said, looking up from the containment device. "The containment process. It won't just close the rift." "What will it do?" Reynolds demanded, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. "It will collapse a portion of both dimensions in the process. The energy has to go somewhere." Tanaka gestured to the living structures around them. "This ecosystem, these entities, many of them will be destroyed. And in our dimension, at least a quarter-mile radius around the facility will be affected." "The facility is isolated enough that the damage would be contained," Cooper noted. "It's not just physical damage," Tanaka continued. "It's dimensional scarring. Neither reality will ever be quite the same at the intersection point." The team fell silent, the moral weight of their mission suddenly heavier. They'd come to save their world, but at what cost to another? "Is there any other way?" Morgan asked, her scientist's curiosity warring with her human compassion. Tanaka hesitated. "I could modify the device to minimize the damage, distribute the collapse more evenly, between dimensions, but it would require manual operation. Someone would need to stay behind to modulate the field as it forms." "No automated option?" Reynolds pressed. "The variables are too complex. It would require human judgment and adjustment in real time." Tanaka tapped the control panel. "I could program a basic sequence, but someone would need to make continual adjustments as the field propagates." Cooper looked at his darkening hand. "I'm already changing. I'll stay." "No," Reynolds said firmly. "I'll do it." The team stared at him in shock. "Captain, that's suicide," Williams protested. "There's no guarantee the suit would protect you during collapse." Reynolds shook his head. "I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 3 months ago. 6 months to live, at best. This way, my death means something." The revelation stunned them into silence. Morgan's eyes widened with understanding. "The painkillers in your quarters," she said softly. "The weight loss. I thought it was just the stress of the new position." "Alex, why didn't you tell anyone?" Cooper asked, using Reynolds' first name for the first time since they'd met. "Because I would have been removed from duty," he replied simply, "and I wasn't ready for that. Now how do I operate this thing, Dr. Tanaka?" While Tanaka began explaining the modified procedure, Williams stepped away, then returned with determination in her eyes. "I'm staying too," she announced. "Lieutenant," Reynolds began. "With respect, sir, the operation requires 2 people to maximize survival on both sides. 1 to monitor the feedback, 1 to adjust the field harmonics." She looked at Tanaka, who reluctantly nodded confirmation. "She's right. 2 operators would increase effectiveness by approximately 60%. The dimensional collapse would be more controlled, potentially saving lives in both realms." Reynolds studied his lieutenant's face, recognizing the resolve in her expression. "You understand what this means? There's likely no way back." "Better than most, sir," she replied. "My brother was on level 5 when the black substance first appeared. I saw the security footage. If this is the price for stopping that from happening to more people, I'm willing to pay it." As Tanaka completed the modifications, the environment around them began to change. The tower trembled. The walls pulsed more rapidly. and the energy flow toward the rift intensified. Outside, visible through occasional windows that formed in the tower's structure, the shadow entities, the shades, moved with greater urgency. "It knows what we're planning," Morgan said, watching the chamber respond to their intentions. The guardian they'd encountered outside materialized partially through one wall, its form now more defined, more focused. It made no move to stop them, but its presence conveyed a clear message. It was watching, evaluating. "Then we need to move quickly," Reynolds decided. "Cooper, get Morgan and Tanaka back through the rift. Williams and I will handle things here." Cooper saluted, the darkness now spreading visibly up his arm. "It's been an honor, Captain." "Likewise, Major." Morgan embraced Reynolds, then Williams. "There might be a way to retrieve you after, if the resonance patterns stabilize." "Dr. Morgan," Reynolds interrupted gently, "go home, close the door behind you." Tanaka bowed deeply to both Reynolds and Williams. "Your sacrifice honors us all." With final farewells exchanged, Cooper led Morgan and Tanaka towards the rift, following their tethers. As they prepared to cross, Cooper turned back, one last time. "I'll make sure they know what you did here," he promised. Then the three stepped through the vortex and were gone. Reynolds and Williams turned to the modified device, now humming with building energy. Its blue core pulsed more rapidly, synchronizing with the rift's own rhythm. "Are you sure about this, Lieutenant?" Reynolds asked as they began the activation sequence, his fingers dancing across controls that Tanaka had hastily labeled for them. Williams nodded, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the core. "My whole life I've wondered if any of it matters. Now I know." She adjusted a series of dials as Tanaka had instructed. "What about you, sir? Any regrets?" Reynolds thought of his life, the military career that had consumed his youth, the relationship sacrificed to duty, the diagnosis that had seemed like a cruel joke after surviving war zones. "Just one. I wish I'd seen more sunrises." "Maybe we will," Williams said, surprising him with her optimism. "Patel said they were becoming part of this place, not dying. Maybe there's something after the collapse." The device's hum deepened to a resonant tone that made their bones vibrate. The rift began to constrict, its edges folding inward. "First phase initiated," Reynolds confirmed, beginning harmonic modulation. Around them, the chamber responded. The walls flowed more rapidly and the ceiling began to descend. The Guardian manifested more fully, its massive form now hovering near them, observing with what almost seemed like respect. "I think we have company," William said, nodding toward the entity. The Guardian extended a portion of itself towards the device, not interfering, but adding its own energies to the process. Where it touched the control panel, new patterns formed, adjustments beyond human understanding. "I think it's helping us," Reynolds realized. "It wants the rift closed too." "Makes sense," Williams replied, monitoring the feedback displays. "If this dimension is alive, the rift must be like an open wound. We're the surgeons." The rumbling increased. Outside the tower, the landscape began to contract toward them, as if the entire dimension were folding in on itself. The sky churned more violently, energy discharges becoming more frequent, more intense. "Second phase in 3 minutes, Reynolds announced. "After that, we'll have approximately 5 minutes before collapse." Williams nodded, her hands steady on the controls despite the trembling floor beneath them. "It's been an honor serving with you, Captain." "Zoe," he said, using her first name. "The honor has been mine." The return journey was a chaotic nightmare for Cooper, Morgan, and Tanaka. As the containment device powered up, the shadow dimension reacted violently. The ground heaved and buckled beneath their feet. The sky unleashed streams of energy that scorched the terrain around them. Shadow entities flitted past, some fleeing the collapsing zone, others moving purposefully toward it. "Keep moving," Cooper shouted as a section of ground disappeared into nothingness behind them. The tethers pulled them toward the original entry point, but the path had changed, obstacles appearing where none had existed before. Morgan stumbled, her foot sinking into ground that suddenly liquefied, her tether snagged on a rising formation that resembled a twisted version of a communication tower from their facility. As she struggled to free herself, one of the larger shades approached. Cooper raised his weapon, but Morgan waved him off. "Wait, I don't think it's attacking." The entity reached out, its form rippling. With a precise movement, it severed the snagged portion of the tether while preserving the connection to their dimension. Then it pushed Morgan forward, a clear instruction to run. In that brief moment of contact, Morgan experienced the flash of communication, not in words, but in pure concept. Understanding, necessity, continuance. The entity knew what they were doing and why it was necessary. It conveyed a complex idea that Morgan's mind translated as, "What dies here will be reborn elsewhere. The boundary must be restored." They reached the original entry point as the collapse accelerated. The landscape around them began to fold inward, structures compressing and merging. The rift had shrunk considerably, the edges becoming unstable, flickering between existence and non-existence. "Jump now," Tanaka yelled as the opening fluctuated wildly. They threw themselves through the rift, experiencing once again the cold syrup sensation of transition. They tumbled onto the laboratory floor on the other side, just as the rift contracted to a pinpoint and vanished with a sound like thunder. The facility shook once, violently, then stabilized. Emergency teams rushed in, helping them to their feet. Dr. Wright pushed through the crowd, her face a mixture of hope and dread. Did it work? Where are Reynolds and Williams? Cooper, the darkness now receding from his arm, shook his head silently. The black substance that had invaded the facility began to dissolve, returning to its component elements. Affected areas remained damaged, but the active threat disappeared with the closing of the rift. Klaxons continued to blare as cleanup teams in hazmat suits began neutralizing the residual contamination. Government officials arrived within hours, securing the site and debriefing the survivors extensively. 3 days later, as Morgan packed her research materials under the watchful eye of federal agents, she noticed something odd in her reflection in a glass cabinet. For just a moment, her shadow moved independently of her body, a subtle shift that no one else noticed. That night, alone in her quarters, she removed a small container from her pocket, a sample vial containing what appeared to be a fragment of darkness from the shadow dimension. Unlike the invasive black substance that had spread through the facility, this sample remained contained, responsive. When she held it, she felt the same flash of communication she'd experienced with the entity that helped her. Understanding, necessity, continuance. The containment procedure had worked. The rift had closed. But nothing is ever truly destroyed, only transformed. In her dreams that night, Morgan saw Reynolds and Williams standing in a landscape of shifting beauty. The tower had become a spire of crystalline light. The shades moved around them, communicating through shared perception. Reynolds reached out, touching a sunrise that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, his face peaceful for the first time since she'd known him. 3 months later, in a new facility far from Alaska, Dr. Morgan calibrated sensitive instruments that detected faint quantum signatures. The government had been quick to restart the research under tighter controls, eager to harness the potential energy sources the shadow dimension represented. But Morgan had her own agenda now. On the screen before her, 2 distinct energy patterns pulsed in perfect rhythm. Patterns that exactly matched the neural signatures of Alexander Reynolds and Zoe Williams. She smiled as she began drafting plans for a new experiment, one designed not to tear reality apart, but to build a bridge between worlds. This time they would do it right. Outside her window, her shadow stretched across the lawn, briefly forming a shape that looked remarkably like a hand, reaching back towards her in greeting. The connection between dimensions hadn't been severed. It had merely been transformed into something new, something potentially wonderful. And somewhere in the space between worlds, Reynolds and Williams continued their most important mission, not destroying or conquering, but understanding and connecting. For in the shadow of existence, they had discovered a profound truth. No barrier is truly impenetrable, and no division truly complete. The universe, in all its dimensions, seeks harmony, even if the path to that harmony passes through chaos. In the darkness beyond human perception, Reynolds finally found what had eluded him in life. Purpose beyond duty, healing beyond medicine, and sunrises unlike any he could have imagined.